The scream that pierced the Arizona dawn wasn't human, but Samuel McBride knew the sound of agony when he heard it. His weathered hands tightened around the Winchester rifle as he crept through the mesquite brush, following the intermittent cries that echoed across the red sandstone canyon. 3 years of solitude had sharpened his senses like a blade, and every instinct told him this wasn't the wail of an injured animal. The sun hung low and merciless above the jagged horizon, casting long shadows that danced across the desert floor like specters from his nightmares. Samuel moved with the practiced silence of a man who had learned that survival meant becoming invisible, his boots finding purchase on the loose shale without disturbing a single pebble. The temperature was already climbing toward what promised to be another scorching day, but a cold sweat beaded on his forehead as memories threatened to surface. Another cry, weaker this time, drifted from behind a cluster of barrel cacti. Samuel paused, his finger resting lightly on the trigger as he studied the terrain ahead. The sound was coming from a shallow arroyo where winter rains had carved a temporary creek bed, now nothing more than cracked earth and scattered bones of small creatures that had sought water and found only death. As he rounded the natural stone barrier, Samuel's breath caught in his throat. A young Apache warrior, perhaps 17 or 18 years old, lay crumpled against the canyon wall like a broken doll. His left leg was trapped beneath a massive boulder that had apparently given way during the night, and dark stains spread across the red dirt beneath him. The boy's face was a mask of pain and defiance, his obsidian eyes fixed on Samuel with a mixture of fear and hatred that cut through the older man's soul like a rusty knife. For a moment that stretched into eternity, neither man moved. The desert silence enveloped them, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead and the boy's labored breathing. Samuel felt his pulse hammering against his temples as images flooded his mind unbidden. Thomas, his 12-year-old son, running through these same canyons with his arms outstretched like wings, laughing at some private joke only children understood. Margaret, his beloved wife, hanging laundry on the line behind their modest homestead, her auburn hair catching the morning light like spun gold. The Apache boy's lips moved, forming words in his native tongue that Samuel didn't understand but whose meaning was clear enough. Defiance, even in the face of death. It was the same expression Thomas had worn during his final moments, when the raiders had swept down from the hills like demons from hell itself. Samuel's knuckles went white as he gripped the rifle, fighting the urge to simply pull the trigger and end this unexpected confrontation. But something stayed his hand. Perhaps it was the boy's youth, or the way his fingers clutched at a leather pouch hanging from his neck with the desperate intensity of someone clinging to life itself. Or maybe it was the growing realization that fate had delivered this moment to his doorstep like a gift wrapped in barbed wire, offering him something he had prayed for during 3 years of sleepless nights. The opportunity for justice. For closure. For the kind of reckoning that the law had never been able to provide. Samuel lowered his rifle slowly, his mind racing through possibilities that made his stomach churn with equal parts revulsion and anticipation. The boy's eyes tracked his movement, a flicker of hope replacing some of the defiance when the barrel swung away from his chest. It was a cruel hope, Samuel knew, but he wasn't ready to extinguish it yet. The morning heat was becoming oppressive, creating shimmering mirages that danced across the desert floor like liquid mercury. Samuel removed his hat and wiped the sweat from his brow, using the moment to study his unexpected prisoner more carefully. The boy wore traditional Apache clothing, but there was something different about him, something that set him apart from the raiders who had destroyed Samuel's world. His features were more refined, almost aristocratic, and the beadwork on his vest displayed a level of craftsmanship that spoke of high status within his tribe. A chief's son, perhaps. Or the offspring of a respected shaman. The thought sent a dark thrill through Samuel's chest, followed immediately by a wave of self-loathing that threatened to buckle his knees. What was he becoming? What had grief and isolation done to the man he used to be? The Apache boy tried to shift his position, crying out as the movement sent fresh waves of agony through his trapped leg. Samuel watched impassively, noting how the young warrior bit down on his lower lip to stifle further sounds. Pride, even in agony. It reminded him so much of Thomas that for a moment he almost forgot where he was, almost reached out to comfort this broken child the way he had comforted his son after nightmares or scraped knees. Instead, he took a step closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. The boy's hand moved instinctively toward a knife at his belt, but the weapon was clearly beyond his reach, knocked away when the boulder had pinned him to the ground. Samuel could see the blade glinting in a crevice several feet away, its bone handle carved with intricate symbols that probably told stories of hunts and victories he would never understand. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the first stirrings of the desert wind that would grow into a howling monster by afternoon. Samuel knew he had to make a decision soon. Leaving the boy here meant certain death from exposure or predators, assuming the crushed leg didn't kill him first from blood loss or infection. Killing him outright would be a mercy, but mercy wasn't what Samuel's nightmares demanded. There was a third option, one that made his hands tremble as he considered its implications. He could free the boy, tend his wounds, keep him alive long enough to extract the kind of justice that had eluded him for 3 long years. The thought should have horrified him, should have sent him fleeing back to his cabin to pray for forgiveness and try to forget this moment had ever happened. Instead, it filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since the day he buried his family. Samuel walked to where a dead cottonwood had fallen across the arroyo, its trunk bleached white by years of sun and weather. He tested its strength, then used it as a lever to shift the boulder just enough to free the boy's mangled leg. The Apache cried out despite his best efforts to remain silent, his body going rigid with shock as blood flow returned to the damaged limb. Working quickly, Samuel fashioned a crude splint from broken branches and strips torn from his own shirt. The boy watched him work with eyes that held more questions than answers, clearly struggling to understand why his captor was showing such care. Samuel avoided that penetrating gaze, focusing instead on the mechanical process of binding wounds and stabilizing bones, skills he had learned during his brief service in the Union Army 20 years ago. When the makeshift medical treatment was complete, Samuel sat back on his heels and finally met the boy's eyes directly. What he saw there made him question everything he thought he knew about revenge and justice. There was pain, yes, and fear, but also a kind of resigned dignity that reminded him uncomfortably of his own reflection in darker moments. The Apache boy spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. This time Samuel caught a few words he recognized from his limited interactions with peaceful tribes in years past. Water. Please. Family. Family. The word hit Samuel like a physical blow, bringing with it a fresh wave of memories he had spent 3 years trying to drown in whiskey and solitude. Thomas building elaborate fortresses from river stones, his small hands moving with the focused intensity of a master architect. Margaret teaching their son to read by firelight, her patient voice turning simple words into magical incantations that opened doorways to other worlds. All of it gone in a single afternoon of screaming horses and painted warriors and smoke that had stained the sky black for 3 days. Samuel stood abruptly, his decision crystallizing with a clarity that both thrilled and terrified him. He would take the boy back to his cabin. He would tend his wounds and nurse him back to health. And then, when the time was right, when the Apache was strong enough to truly understand what was happening to him, Samuel would exact the kind of payment that might finally allow him to sleep without seeing his family's faces in his dreams. The boy must have sensed the change in his captor's demeanor, because his expression shifted from cautious hope to something approaching dread. Samuel bent down and carefully lifted the young warrior in his arms, surprised by how light he seemed despite his obvious strength. The Apache winced but didn't cry out as Samuel began the slow journey back through the canyon, each step carrying them both toward a reckoning that had been 3 years in the making. The morning sun climbed higher as they moved through the desert landscape, painting the sandstone cliffs in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Samuel found himself wondering about the boy's name, his family, the circumstances that had brought him to this remote corner of Arizona territory. Was he part of a raiding party, or simply a young hunter who had wandered too far from his people? Did he have parents who were already searching for him, or siblings who would mourn his disappearance? These questions should have given Samuel pause, should have rekindled whatever humanity still flickered in the depths of his grief-hardened heart. Instead, they only strengthened his resolve. Let them search. Let them mourn. Let them know the taste of loss and helplessness that had become his daily bread. By the time they reached the small cabin that had been Samuel's refuge and prison for the past 3 years, the sun was approaching its zenith and the temperature was climbing toward unbearable. The structure was modest but well-maintained, built from local stone and timber with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of better times. A vegetable garden struggled against the desert heat behind the house, and a small corral held 2 horses that watched their approach with curious eyes. Samuel carried his burden inside, noting how the boy's gaze took in every detail of the sparsely furnished interior. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel decorated with a daguerreotype of Samuel's family and a few carved wooden toys that Thomas had treasured. Simple furniture filled the space, much of it built by Samuel's own hands during long winter nights when sleep refused to come. He placed the Apache boy on his own bed, the only mattress in the cabin, then stepped back to consider his next moves. The young warrior's eyes never left his face, as if trying to read his captor's intentions in the lines and shadows etched by grief and isolation. Samuel found that penetrating stare unsettling, a reminder that his prisoner was not merely an object for vengeance but a thinking, feeling human being with his own stories and dreams and fears. The thought should have been sobering. Instead, it only made the prospect of what was to come more satisfying. Samuel began gathering supplies for a more thorough treatment of the boy's injuries. Clean bandages, laudanum for the pain, needle and thread for the deeper cuts. As he worked, he found himself humming a tune that Margaret used to sing while she cooked, a haunting melody that seemed to fill the cabin with echoes of happier times. The Apache boy listened to the wordless song with an expression Samuel couldn't quite read, and for a moment the older man wondered if music might be a language that transcended the barriers of tribe and blood and history. Then he remembered Thomas's broken body in the ruins of their home, and the moment of connection shattered like glass. The boy would heal, Samuel decided as he began the careful process of cleaning and dressing wounds. He would grow strong again, strong enough to understand exactly what was being done to him and why. And when that day came, when the debt that had been 3 years in the accruing finally came due, Samuel McBride would at last be able to lay his family's ghosts to rest. The desert wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending dust devils dancing across the hardpan. Inside the cabin, 2 men regarded each other across a chasm of language and culture and pain, each carrying secrets that would shape the days to come in ways neither could yet imagine. The capture was complete. Now the real reckoning could begin. 3 weeks passed like a fever dream, each day blending into the next in a haze of medicinal rituals and unspoken tensions that filled the cabin like smoke from a dying fire. Samuel McBride had become a reluctant nurse, tending to his prisoners' wounds with the same methodical precision he once applied to mending fences or shoeing horses. The Apache boy, who had finally whispered his name as Ayanna during a moment of delirium, grew stronger with each sunrise, his dark eyes tracking Samuel's movements with an intelligence that made the older man increasingly uncomfortable. The young warrior's leg was healing faster than Samuel had expected, the clean breaks mending with the resilience of youth and a constitution hardened by life in the desert. But it was the boy's spirit that proved most troubling to his captor. Where Samuel had expected sullen defiance or broken resignation, he found instead a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the small space between them with unasked questions and uncomfortable truths. Ayanna spoke little, and when he did, it was in careful English learned from trading posts and missionary schools, his words chosen with the precision of someone navigating a minefield of cultural misunderstandings. He never asked why Samuel had saved him, never pleaded for release or mercy. Instead, he observed everything with the focused attention of a hunter studying prey, cataloging details that might prove useful when the moment for action arrived. Samuel found these silences more unnerving than screams would have been. He had prepared himself for hatred, for the kind of burning rage that had consumed his own heart for 3 years. What he hadn't expected was the way Ayanna studied the daguerreotype on the mantel with something approaching reverence, or how the boy's fingers traced the carved animals Thomas had treasured as if they were sacred relics. The nights were the worst. Samuel would lie on his makeshift bedroll near the fireplace, listening to Ayanna's breathing and fighting the urge to simply end this strange interlude with a bullet or a blade. But something always stayed his hand, some nagging voice in the depths of his conscience that sounded suspiciously like Margaret's gentle wisdom. She would have been horrified by what he was planning, he knew. She would have seen the humanity in this young Apache warrior that Samuel was trying desperately to ignore. On the 20th night, everything changed. Samuel woke to the sound of singing, a low, haunting melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself and fill the cabin with echoes of ancient sorrows. Ayanna was sitting upright in the bed, his face turned toward the window where moonlight painted silver patterns on the floor. The song was in Apache, the words incomprehensible to Samuel but the emotion behind them universal as grief itself. The older man lay still and listened, transfixed despite himself by the raw pain in that young voice. The melody spoke of loss and longing, of promises broken and loved ones taken too soon. It was a lament that could have been torn from Samuel's own heart, and the recognition of that shared anguish hit him like a physical blow. When the song ended, silence settled over the cabin like snow. Ayanna turned to look directly at Samuel, and in that moment the pretense that his captor was asleep became impossible to maintain. Their eyes met across the dimly lit space, two men bound together by circumstances neither had chosen, each carrying wounds that might never fully heal. Samuel sat up slowly, his joints protesting after weeks of sleeping on the hard floor. The movement should have been threatening, should have sent Ayanna scrambling for a weapon or cowering in fear. Instead, the young Apache simply watched him with those disconcertingly intelligent eyes, waiting to see what would happen next. They stayed like that for long minutes, studying each other across the chasm of language and culture and loss that separated them. Finally, Samuel found his voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper in the desert night. The boy's name escaped his lips like a prayer, and hearing it spoken aloud seemed to break some invisible barrier between them. Ayanna nodded slowly, then spoke words that would haunt Samuel for the rest of his days. "My sister was 12 when the soldiers came to our village. She had hair like sunlight on water and a laugh that could make the old women remember being young. They killed her while she was picking berries by the stream, shot her down like a rabbit and left her for the crows." The words hung in the air between them, each syllable carefully chosen and delivered with devastating precision. Samuel felt something crack inside his chest, a pain so sharp and unexpected that he actually gasped. The boy was talking about loss, about family destroyed by violence, about the kind of grief that transforms people into something they never intended to become. He was talking about the very thing that had brought them to this moment. Samuel's hands began to shake as the full implications of what Ayanna was telling him sank in. This wasn't just some random Apache warrior who had wandered too far from his people. This was someone who understood exactly what Samuel had lost, because he had lost the same things. The raids and counter-raids, the endless cycle of violence and retribution that had turned the Arizona territory into a charnel house of broken families and shattered dreams. They were both victims. They were both survivors. And somewhere in the twisted logic of frontier justice, that made them both guilty of the same crime. Samuel staggered to his feet and walked to the window, pressing his palms against the cool glass as if it might provide some anchor to reality. Outside, the desert stretched away into infinity under a star-filled sky that had witnessed more blood and sorrow than any landscape should be asked to bear. He thought about Thomas, about Margaret, about the life they had tried to build in this harsh and beautiful place that demanded such a terrible price from those who dared to call it home. Behind him, Ayanna continued speaking, his voice soft but relentless as desert wind. "For 3 years I have tracked the soldiers who killed my sister. I learned their names, their faces, the sound of their voices when they laugh. I followed them from fort to fort, waiting for the right moment, the perfect opportunity for justice. 2 weeks ago, I found the last one drinking in a saloon in Tucson. I put my knife between his ribs while he was telling jokes about Indian squaws." Samuel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words settle over him like a burial shroud. The boy hadn't been part of a raiding party when Samuel found him. He had been returning from his own mission of vengeance, his own quest for the kind of closure that seemed to slip away like water no matter how much blood was spilled in its pursuit. They were the same man, separated only by the color of their skin and the particular tragedy that had shaped their lives. Both of them had lost family to violence. Both of them had spent years consumed by the need for retribution. Both of them had crossed lines that decent people weren't supposed to cross, justified by grief and sanctified by the unforgiving code of the frontier. The realization should have been liberating. It should have led to understanding, perhaps even to some form of peace between them. Instead, it only made what Samuel was planning to do more necessary than ever. Samuel turned away from the window and walked to the wooden chest where he kept his most precious possessions. His hands moved with steady purpose as he retrieved the items he had been saving for this moment, a straight razor that had belonged to his father, a bottle of whiskey that had been aging since before Thomas was born, and a length of rope that had once been used to tie back Margaret's hair when she worked in the garden. Ayanna watched these preparations without comment, but Samuel could see understanding dawning in those dark eyes. The boy knew what was coming, knew that the strange interlude of healing and careful coexistence was about to end. And yet he didn't plead or struggle or try to escape. He simply waited, as if he had always known that his own quest for vengeance would eventually lead him to this cabin and this moment and this particular form of justice. Samuel set the items on the small table beside the bed, arranging them with the same care Margaret had once used when setting the table for Sunday dinner. The razor caught the moonlight and threw it back in silver fragments that danced across the cabin walls like ghosts. The whiskey gleamed amber in its bottle, promising oblivion for whatever came after. The rope coiled like a sleeping snake, innocent and deadly in equal measure. When the preparations were complete, Samuel sat down in the chair beside the bed and looked directly into Ayanna's eyes. What he saw there surprised him. Not fear, not anger, but something approaching relief. As if the young Apache warrior was as tired of carrying his burden of grief and guilt as Samuel was of carrying his own. They understood each other perfectly now, these two broken men who had been thrown together by forces beyond their control. They had both chosen vengeance over justice, violence over healing, the easy satisfaction of inflicting pain over the harder work of learning to live with loss. And now, in this small cabin at the edge of nowhere, the bill for those choices was finally coming due. Samuel reached for the razor, feeling its familiar weight in his palm. The blade was sharp enough to split a hair, honed to perfection by years of careful maintenance. It would be quick, he told himself. Merciful, even. Far more merciful than what had been done to Thomas, far more merciful than what Ayanna had probably done to that soldier in Tucson. But as his fingers closed around the handle, something unexpected happened. The boy began to sing again, the same haunting melody that had broken the silence earlier. This time, however, the words were in English, translated so that Samuel could understand every syllable of pain and longing and regret. The song told the story of a young warrior who had lost his way in the desert of his own anger, who had wandered so far from his people and his purpose that he could no longer find the path home. It spoke of choices made in darkness that seemed right at the time but cast shadows that grew longer with each passing day. It was a lament for innocence lost and prices paid and the terrible weight of carrying someone else's blood on your hands. It was Samuel's story as much as it was Ayanna's, and hearing it sung in that clear young voice made something crack inside the older man's chest. The razor slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor, its blade reflecting moonlight like tears. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Ayanna reached out and placed his hand over Samuel's, the first physical contact between them since the day of the rescue. His skin was warm and calloused from years of hard living, his grip surprisingly gentle for someone who had killed with his own hands just weeks before. The touch broke something inside Samuel that had been building pressure for 3 long years. The tears came without warning, a flood of grief and rage and self-loathing that he had been holding back since the day he buried his family. He wept for Thomas and Margaret, for the life they had tried to build together and the future that had been stolen from them. He wept for the man he used to be, before loss had transformed him into something he barely recognized. And he wept for this young Apache warrior who had become both his salvation and his damnation, who had shown him a mirror that reflected truths he wasn't sure he was strong enough to face. Ayanna held his hand through it all, offering the kind of wordless comfort that transcended the boundaries of language and culture. When the tears finally stopped, Samuel found himself looking into eyes that held understanding rather than judgment, compassion rather than fear. They sat like that until dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, 2 men who had traveled very different paths to arrive at the same destination. The items on the bedside table remained untouched, relics of a plan that no longer seemed to make sense in the growing light of a new day. Outside, the desert began to stir with life, birds calling to each other across the vastness and small creatures emerging to hunt for food in the cool morning air. When the sun was fully up, Samuel rose and walked to the window again. The landscape that had seemed so hostile and unforgiving in the darkness now revealed its stark beauty, the way light and shadow played across ancient stone and hardy vegetation that had learned to thrive in the harshest conditions. It was a good metaphor for survival, he thought. for the way people learned to adapt to circumstances that should have destroyed them. Behind him, Ayanna spoke softly, his words carrying the weight of prophecy. We can choose to be more than what our pain has made us. My sister would not want me to carry her death like a stone in my heart for the rest of my life. Your family would not want that for you either. Samuel nodded without turning around, knowing that the boy was right but not sure he had the strength to change course after 3 years of traveling the same dark road. The desire for vengeance was like an addiction, a hunger that grew stronger the more you fed it. Breaking free would require a different kind of courage than anything he had ever attempted. But as he watched the sun climb higher over the desert, Samuel McBride began to consider the possibility that redemption might be found not in the spilling of blood, but in the far more difficult act of choosing to stop the cycle of violence that had already claimed too many lives. The razor would stay on the floor where it had fallen. The rope would be returned to its drawer. And 2 broken men would try to find a way to heal wounds that had been festering far too long in the unforgiving heart of the American frontier. The reckoning had come at last, but it was not the one either of them had expected.